Hey Optimancers, Chris here. So last week we discussed the Eldritch Knight and spell selections for an Eldritch Knight, and this week we're going to talk about the Arcane Trickster. The Arcane Trickster, of course, mechanically has some similarities to Eldritch Knight. They use the same spell progression, they gain the same number of spells known, and like the Eldritch Knight, they are limited in the school selections for their spells. And with the Eldritch Knight, we had a limitation of abjuration and evocation, and with the Arcane Trickster, we have different schools. We are limited to enchantment and illusion for the majority of our spells. For the most part, I'd say we're actually much better off with these schools, the schools of illusion and enchantment, than we are with the Eldritch Knight schools. And overall, I think the Arcane Trickster is a stronger subclass in comparison to other rogue subclasses than Eldritch Knight is compared to other fighter subclasses. In fact, I would say that the Arcane Trickster is the best rogue. I would say it's actually the best rogue by a fair amount, in my opinion. But we still do have to carefully consider our spell selections because we have those limited schools, and because certain spells interact with some of our subclass abilities very well or not well at all. And so I want to talk about those interactions as well as we talk about our spell selections. But before we do that, I have a Patreon. You can check out a link in the video description if you're interested in checking it out. But today I just want to thank my newest Archmage subscriber, and that is Matt Couch. Thank you, Matt, for joining our community, and I hope to have you in our one-shots this September. So let's talk about Arcane Tricksters. Let's get started. So when you become a third level rogue, that is when you're going to be choosing your subclass. And as I said, I think Arcane Trickster is the strongest selection you can have as a rogue. You get quite a bit right at level 3. You're going to get 3 spells known. 2 of them have to be from the Enchantment and Illusion schools, and 1 of them can be from any school you want. And we're going to have 2 spell slots. That's the same as a first level primary caster. Second thing, we will be getting 2 cantrips of our choice. But unlike the Eldritch Knight, we're actually going to get a third cantrip as well, and that is the Mage Hand cantrip, and Mage Hand is a pretty good cantrip. Mage Hand is a non-concentration spell, and as a cantrip, of course, we can cast it again and again, and it lasts for 1 minute. You are limited to a 30-foot range, and you can use your action to control the hand, and it essentially is like a light telekinesis. But there are a lot of things a Mage Hand can't do. It can't attack, can't activate magic items, and it can't carry more than 10 pounds. Now, if you have a very lenient DM, they might allow you to have Mage Hand up all the time, just assuming that you recast it every minute. A lot of other DMs are not going to make that assumption, so when you want to use your Mage Hand, you are going to have to use an action to cast it. And this decision actually has a fair bit of weight, because there are some uses for Mage Hand in combat that we can use when we are an Arcane Trickster. So specifically, we get Mage Hand Legerdemain. And the first thing it does is it makes our Mage Hand invisible, and we can do additional things with it. We can retrieve an object or container worn by another creature. That includes creatures that are not friendly to us. We can also stow objects. And finally, we can use Thieves' Tools to pick locks and disarm traps at range. Being able to disarm traps at range is very useful, because sometimes those traps, if they are triggered, will affect a limited area, so as long as we're out of that area, like 30 feet away using a Mage Hand Legerdemain, then we won't necessarily be affected by that trap. Or if you're picking a lock and you didn't detect the trap, like the Poison Needle, this is something that is going to affect other rogues, not going to affect us as an Arcane Trickster. We can certainly use the Mage Hand to pick pockets, and if we do so, we are going to make our sleight of hand check contested by the creature's wisdom perception check, just as if we were actually picking their pockets. But again, very useful to be able to do it at range, because if we do get caught, then we already have 30 feet of range between us and the person who caught us. And it'll be up to your DM to even determine if being noticed necessarily indicates you as being noticed, or just that something happened. And in addition, we can use our bonus action granted by our cunning action to control the hand. And this is what I want to talk about when we're talking about in combat. If we have our Mage Hand up in combat, we can control it with our bonus action using our cunning action. And why would we want to do that? Well, we would want to do that if we have maybe an enemy spellcaster, and that enemy spellcaster has that spell component pouch. We could potentially grab that spell component pouch with the Mage Hand Legerdemain. Or if there's an enemy archer and they have a quiver of arrows, we might be able to take that quiver of arrows from them. Or the enemy that has those potions of healing they keep quaffing, it might be able to take those potions of healing from them. So these are fairly circumstantial uses, but nevertheless, if I have a Mage Hand active while I'm in combat, I'm certainly going to be thinking about how I might use it to debilitate the enemy, using my bonus action only. So the Mage Hand cantrip becomes quite good for us. Mage Hand, as I said, is already a pretty good cantrip, but once we add on Mage Hand Legerdemain, it becomes a very good cantrip. But we are going to get 2 other selections for cantrips, and these can be from any school we like. And frankly, I think the far and away best choice for us is Booming Blade. So Booming Blade is just going to increase our offense if we're using a melee weapon. And even if we are playing a ranged character, we still probably want Booming Blade, because if we end up in melee, we will still want to be using this, even if we're only using something like a short sword or a dagger. Now, the reason why I like this so much on a rogue is, first off, we don't have extra attack with rogue, so we're not giving up an attack in order to use Booming Blade. The second reason is because of Cunning Action, because with Cunning Action we can disengage as a bonus action. So this means we could move up to an enemy, attack it with a Booming Blade, and use our Cunning Action to disengage. And if that enemy is a melee enemy and it wants to get to us on its turn, then it's going to need to move, and if it's going to move, then it is going to trigger the secondary damage. And once we get to 5th level, the damage from our base attack and our secondary damage, if it's triggered, ends up being quite a bit. It's 3d8. This is from a cantrip, and this is in addition to our regular damage, so the damage of our weapon and the damage of our sneak attack if we got sneak attack. And then at 11th level, it becomes 5d8, and then at 17th level, it is 7d8. So this is a lot of extra damage when we're already talking about a character that does a fair amount of damage with a single attack. So if it's allowed, I think Booming Blade is far and away your best first option. And the second option I would normally pick is Minor Illusion. And Minor Illusion, of course, is just fantastic for a rogue character, because sometimes you are in a combat and there is nowhere to hide. If you are entering a combat and there is nowhere to hide, it is difficult on a rogue, especially if you're a ranged rogue. If you are a ranged rogue and you have nowhere to hide, then you really have to count on your party members being in the right position in order for you to get sneak attack at all, and you won't be attacking with advantage. But if we use Minor Illusion, we can use it to create a place where we can hide. And once we do that, then we can use our Cunning Action to hide and make our attacks with advantage. And once our attacks are with advantage, of course, number one, with the rogue, you have so much riding on the single attack that it is important that it hits. But in addition to that, we don't have to worry about the positioning of our allies in terms of getting our sneak attack. Never mind the various utility uses of Minor Illusion, and considering that rogues stereotypically are kind of your scouting characters, your thieving characters, your trickster characters, Minor Illusion just makes a ton of sense thematically as well. Now eventually we're going to get an additional cantrip, and this will happen at 10th level, and at that point I would likely recommend Green Flame Blade. And the reason why I would recommend Green Flame Blade, even though we already have Booming Blade, is because if you have somebody who's beside the person you're attacking, then you can be guaranteed to get that secondary damage. And so what happens with Green Flame Blade is you can count on the secondary damage occurring as long as the conditions are met before you make the attack. With Booming Blade, of course, there's a gamble. You are attacking and then hoping that the enemy will trigger the secondary damage. So this is why I think Green Flame Blade is a nice backup, so that when we can be guaranteed that damage, we would do a Green Flame Blade instead of a Booming Blade. Now, if you are not allowed Sword Coast Adventures Guide, this of course means that both Green Flame Blade and Booming Blade will not be available to you. And should that happen, then you're just as well to take any of the other reasonably good cantrips. There's a number that I think are pretty good for rogues. Light if you don't have dark vision, Control Flames if you do have dark vision, Message, Mold Earth, Shape Water, I think these all have good uses for a rogue character. Now when it comes to our first level spell selections, we're going to get one spell that's available from any school of magic. And I think far and away our best choice is Find Familiar. But with Find Familiar, we can use that familiar to gain the help action. And the help action for a rogue is so good because, again, we don't have extra attack and all our damage is going into one attack. Now a help action only helps you on your first attack during your turn, so this works out perfectly for us. But also, if we just think about the things you can do with Find Familiar in terms of scouting and sneaking, this really fits the idea of a rogue character. So Find Familiar, I just think, is perfect for an Arcane Trickster, and I would take this pretty much every time. But I do need to mention Shield as a strong honorable mention, because as a rogue, we're not going to be wearing heavy armor. We're not going to probably be using a shield. This means that our armor class isn't that great, and Shield can really boost that armor class and shore up something that we're relatively weak on and give us a much better defense. Now it's going to use up our spell slots pretty quick, but I do think it is far and away the best way at this level to boost up your defense if that's what you want to do. I don't think it's as good a selection as Find Familiar, but I do think it's worthy enough to mention that this is something that if you didn't want Find Familiar, if your DM doesn't allow you to use the help action with Find Familiar, I might consider Shield. Now we're going to get a couple choices from our enchantment or illusion schools for wizards. And the first one I'd probably look at is Tasha's Hideous Laughter. I think this is a very strong spell. Now the spells that trigger one enemy and they make a saving throw, and if they make that saving throw nothing happens, I have spoken about many times that those are not my favorite kinds of spells, and this is one of those spells. But the fact that this is a first level spell means that we are giving up a lot less of a resource than casting a higher level spell that would have those same parameters. And Tasha's Hideous Laughter, if they fail their saving throw, really does deliver. They are going to fall prone and become incapacitated, and potentially for up to a minute. The other spell I'd probably consider is Disguise Self. Again, I think this is a utility spell. It's not something we're going to be using in combat, but as a rogue, what a useful spell to be able to disguise yourself using one action, lasts an hour, and doesn't use concentration. So in those non-combat situations that you're often going to find yourself in with a rogue, especially there's certain challenges that a rogue can expect to face, or a rogue style character can expect to face, where Disguise Self is just going to come up again and again, and I think a very strong choice. The other one I might consider is Silent Image. I think this is also a good choice for a third level Arcane Trickster, and because with Silent Image, it is just going to be so much more versatile than a minor illusion, because we can create bigger illusions, we can create illusions that move, we can create more complex illusions, illusions of creatures. Though, technically speaking, what you can do with Silent Image is, because Silent Image is, of course, silent, and because Minor Illusion can create sound and doesn't use your concentration, they can technically be combined. If you use two actions, you can cast a Silent Image, and then you can use Minor Illusion to give that image sound. Now, moving into 7th level, we're going to be making our first 2nd level selection, and this is limited to Enchantment or Illusion. And there's 3 spells here I'd really consider, and it depends on what you want to do with your rogue. The first one I would consider is Mirror Image. I think Mirror Image is a very strong defensive spell. It doesn't use your concentration, and it is an illusion spell, so it is applicable to Arcane Tricksters. So if you want to boost up your defense, Mirror Image is a good choice. And I probably should mention as well that with a rogue, one thing that can be very strong offensively is if you can figure out ways to use your reaction when it's not your turn to make an additional attack. This is just something that, as a rogue, will give you an additional sneak attack in a round. Now, there are a number of ways to accomplish this. A lot of them involve using other party members. So you have your Battle Master, and they have something like Commander Strike, and they give you that additional reaction attack. But if we were to take something like the Sentinel feat, this would allow us to make a reaction attack if an enemy targets anyone other than us if we are within melee range. Now this is a little bit tricky, but technically speaking in Mirror Image, Each time a creature targets you with an attack during the spell's duration, you roll a d20 to determine whether the attack instead targets one of your duplicates. So if the attack instead targets one of your duplicates, then that enemy is attacking something other than you. So technically speaking, with a Sentinel, you should probably get your reaction attack. Now, I'm not sure all DMs are going to agree with that, but if we're just reading the rules, that's how it would read. But if I wanted to focus on defense for my rogue, Mirror Image is a no-brainer. Now, if I wanted to focus on offense, I'd be looking at something else. I'd be looking at Shadowblade. Shadowblade, again, a really strong choice for a rogue, and Illusion School, so it fits within our limited school selections. This is a bonus action casting that's going to give us a weapon that's going to be doing 2d8 damage. It has the finesse property, it has the light property, so we can use it in combination with two-weapon fighting. It has the throw-in property, so we can be using it at range. And if the enemy is in dim light or darkness, we make that roll with advantage. So when we get in those combats where we are in dim light, for example, this becomes a really, really strong cast because it's going to be advantage on every attack we make. And we're not putting our familiar in harm's way, or familiars get lost sometimes. Sometimes the enemy attacks them and kills them and you lose your advantage. But Shadowblade would just give you advantage on all attacks. Now the issues with Shadowblade I've talked about before. It is a 1 minute duration, so that means you're really only going to be able to use it in one combat, and it is using your concentration. And this limits what else we can cast, and concentration can be broken. But still, if I wanted to focus on my offense, I think Shadowblade is a really strong choice at this level. But if I wanted to focus more on controlling the battlefield, then I would be looking at the Phantasmal Force spell. As an illusion spell, again, this is available to us. Once again, this is one of those spells that targets a single enemy, and if they make a save, nothing happens. But the advantage of a Phantasmal Force spell is the save they're going to make is intelligence, and intelligence saves tend to be the worst save in the game. Very few creatures are proficient in intelligence saving throws, and a lot of creatures have terrible intelligence scores. This means against a lot of creatures, Phantasmal Force is actually pretty reliable. Now, when we are talking about illusion spells, and Phantasmal Force is very much an illusion spell, the DM is going to have a lot of say over how much you can do with this. I've seen a lot of people do the Skyrim thing, where they put an upside down bucket over somebody's head so they are blinded. Can Phantasmal Force impose the blinded condition? And this is really going to be up to your DM. When we are talking about illusions, we are automatically going to have some vague things that the DM is going to have to decide what works and what doesn't work. And so when I'm looking at Phantasmal Force, I am going to be thinking about my DM. How is my DM going to be dealing with illusions? If you have a DM that doesn't play well with illusions, don't take Phantasmal Force. But the nice thing is unlike with the Eldritch Knight, when we're getting to our second level spells, we have multiple options that are all good. And if your DM doesn't play well with illusions, no problem. Take Shadowblade, take Mirror Image. Those have very specifically worded spell descriptions that are going to allow you to use them effectively. And it's very nice to be able to choose a very strong defensive option and a very strong offensive option, both within the schools of magic that we are limited to. So once we get to being able to pick a spell from any school, which happens at 8th level, we have a lot more freedom. And there's two spells I think are really good selections. The first of them is Web. This can affect multiple enemies, potentially several enemies. They're all going to have to make saving throws, and any that fail are going to be restrained. Restrained for your enemies is very nice for you to have as a rogue, because this is going to give you advantage on every attack you make, and any attacks they make against you are with disadvantage. And if they're stuck with melee attacks and you stick at range, they're not going to be able to attack you at all. They're only going to be able to use their action to try to break the web. And Web has a very good duration. This means we can even use it to trap hallways, that kind of thing as well. So there's utility uses for Web as well as combat uses. This is a really strong second level spell, and I think for a rogue this is a really good choice. But the other one I would consider is Levitate, because Levitate has, of course, strong utility use. When we are talking about 7th level, It's very likely we don't have a reliable method of flight, and sometimes you just need to get up somewhere, but also Levitate can be a strong defensive spell. If you are in harm's way, Levitation can often save you, or save another party member. And finally, Levitate has an offensive use as well. We can use it to control an enemy by levitating them, and if it's a melee enemy, that is going to essentially take them out of the combat. And again, it's one of those spells that provides a single saving throw, and if they make their save, nothing happens. But it is a single saving throw. Once they fail that saving throw, you can take them out of the combat, as long as you are able to maintain concentration, which can be up to 10 minutes. So for 8th level, I'd be looking at Web or Levitate. Then at 9th level, something very special happens. We gain the Magical Ambush ability. Starting at 9th level, if you are hidden from a creature when you cast a spell on it, the creature has disadvantage on any saving throw it makes against the spell this turn. Now if we compare this to the metamagic for sorcerers, Heightened Spell, that metamagic requires 3 sorcery points to give one target of the spell disadvantage on its first saving throw against the spell. The huge difference between these two is Magical Ambush does not specify one creature. This will work on every creature that you target with a spell on your turn. The disadvantage of Magical Ambush is it only applies to saving throws made on your turn. So if we look back at the Web spell, we can see that the enemies don't make any saving throws on your turn. They make saving throws on their own turn. This means that Web doesn't benefit from Magical Ambush. But if we look at a spell like Levitate, for example, it does benefit from Magical Ambush. And so now we probably want to be looking at spells like Web and determine, is that still going to be worthwhile for us? We also want to be looking at spells like Phantasmal Force, because once we are targeting intelligence and providing disadvantage, this becomes an extremely reliable spell. But at 13th level, it becomes insane. And the reason it becomes insane is because we are going to be picking our 3rd level spells. We're limited to Enchantment and Illusion, and that's no problem at all, because these are exactly the spells we would want. And there's 2 that just jump out, and those are Hypnotic Pattern and Fear. Both of these are within the schools that we can cast, and both of them are going to target multiple enemies, and if those enemies fail their saving throw, they are debilitated. And because we can target multiple enemies, this is going to work so well with Magical Ambush, because it means that those creatures are all going to make their saving throws with disadvantage. This makes Hypnotic Pattern and Fear extremely reliable when cast by a 13th level Arcane Trickster. And Hypnotic Pattern and Fear, even if you're playing a wizard, are still spells you're going to be relying on at these levels as some of your more effective control spells. But an Arcane Trickster will be able to cast them more effectively because they are providing disadvantage on all saving throws. And even if that wizard has increased their intelligence, that is not going to provide as many missed saving throws as a disadvantage on everybody targeted. So Hypnotic Pattern gives you a 30-foot cube, can be cast up to 120-foot range, and any creature that fails their saving throw is charmed, incapacitated, and has a speed of 0. And they do not get another saving throw. The only way to break it is if your concentration breaks, or the spell expires, or they are hit for damage, or shaken out of their stupor using an action. This can lock down a ton of enemies. And Fear is the other one I would consider. 30-foot cone, this makes it much harder to place than a Hypnotic Pattern. Hypnotic Pattern is one of those ones where you don't really have to worry about where you are on the battlefield. You just are going to put that cube wherever you want it. With Fear, you have to be in just the right position to get that cone in the right position. So it's a harder spell to place, harder spell to get as many enemies in. But creatures that fail their save are frightened by the spell, and they have to take the dash action on their turn to move away from you. That basically takes them out of the combat. And again, like with Hypnotic Pattern, no additional saving throws. In this case, not until they get out of line of sight from you, or you lose your concentration, or the spell duration of a minute expires. So Fear, again, can just totally mess up an enemy. It gets them all over the battlefield separated. Small numbers are attacking you at a time. It allows you to just do that divide and conquer technique that works so well. At 13th level, we're going to get Versatile Trickster. This is not nearly as flashy as Magical Ambush. Magical Ambush is a huge subclass ability. Versatile Trickster is okay. Basically, we get one more use for our Mage Hand, and on a bonus action during our turn, you can use the Mage Hand to get advantage on attack rolls against a creature. Now, if we have Find Familiar, we potentially already have a way of getting advantage, or potentially with Shadow Blade we have a way of getting advantage, or potentially just by using a bonus action to hide and then attacking at range we have a way of getting advantage. So Versatile Trickster may or may not be all that powerful, and it's going to rely having our Mage Hand active in combat. Again, different DMs are going to have this happen a different amount of times. But if I am a melee character, Versatile Trickster is a reliable way to get advantage, and when we have familiars that can die, this just gives us a backup way that we can get that advantage on attacks. Now, when we get to 14th level, we are going to be able to choose a spell from any school, and I would at least consider one more control spell, and the reason is because both Hypnotic Pattern and Fear have a disadvantage, and that disadvantage is that some creatures are going to be immune to the effects. Any creature that is immune to the Charmed condition cannot be affected by Hypnotic Pattern, and any creature that's immune to the Frightened condition cannot be affected by a Fear spell. So when that happens, if you want to do a control, especially if you want to do a control that's going to have a mass effect and benefit from your magical ambush, then you might want to consider the slow spell. Because the slow spell is going to pretty much affect everybody. It's not going to matter if they have condition immunity. Your slow isn't really a condition, it's a spell effect. Nothing's going to be really immune to it unless they're immune to spells in general. Now, the disadvantage of slow is they're going to get a saving throw every turn. Slow also doesn't completely take anybody out of the combat. So when you have Fear or Hypnotic Pattern working, I find they are better. But the nice thing about slow is, number one, it doesn't have friendly fire. So this means that no matter how mixed up your melee is, you can use a slow spell and affect your enemies and not your allies. And secondly, again, because we don't have to worry about Frightened immunity or Charmed immunity. And combined with Magical Ambush, this is going to be very effective. And I should mention how Magical Ambush is going to work, because we can use our Cunning action to hide. The idea would be that we would use our bonus action on our turn to hide, and then our action on our turn to cast a spell. So this can all be accomplished in one turn. So in one turn, we're going to be able to create disadvantage on a number of enemies' saving throws, assuming we make our hide check, which we probably have a pretty good chance at. As a rogue, generally speaking, you're going to have good stealth. The other spell I'd consider taking from any school is Fly. Just because if we get to 14th level and we don't have a method of flight yet, this could be a problem, because we are going to be facing a number of creatures that do have the ability to fly, and this can make it difficult for us or other party members to be effective. Probably Fly is something I would be looking at casting on another party member. Probably I can use at least a short bow or a light crossbow to reasonable effectiveness and have a decent chance of still getting my sneak attack. So I can still do decent damage at range, but there are a number of people in your party who maybe can't. I would be looking at somebody like the Barbarian or the Paladin. Now, your party wizard, for example, might have the Fly spell and might be able to apply it to your party Paladin, but your wizard might have more important, more powerful spells to be concentrating on, because at this point, they're into 7th level spells already. Do they want to be using their concentration to provide a movement effect on one ally? Well, in our case, so much less of what we do relies on spellcasting. Fly is a more reasonable expenditure of that concentration. Now, at the 17th level, we're going to get Spell Thief. And whenever I talk to people about Arcane Trickster who think that Arcane Tricksters aren't good, they constantly mention that Spell Thief is a bad subclass ability. And I agree that Spell Thief doesn't stand up to a lot of the other rogue subclass abilities at this level. Especially if we're talking about like the Thief or the Scout. Both these subclasses get amazing capstone abilities, and Spell Thief doesn't match up to those. But I should remind you that Arcane Tricksters, at 17th level of casting 3rd level spells like Hypnotic Pattern and Fear, granting disadvantage on every saving throw, and we are very close to accessing 4th level spells. This is the reason why Arcane Tricksters are better than those other subclasses. And finally, this is a 17th level ability. We got a great ability at 9th level. 9th level is a level that you might actually achieve in your campaign. 17th level, you likely won't. But I don't think Spell Thief is useless. If we are targeted with a spell, and this doesn't matter whether it's a single target spell against us or we're one of many targets of a spell in an area of effect, we use our reaction, and the creature casting the spell needs to make a saving throw using its spellcasting ability modifier. And if that creature fails the saving throw, the spell's effect against you is negated. And this is not limited by so many things that might limit something like a counterspell. Counterspell, you need to be able to see the spellcaster. With counterspell, you need to be within range of the spellcaster. These do not apply with Spell Thief. With Spell Thief, as soon as an enemy makes a spell attack, this could be a 9th level spell, Spell Thief has at least a chance of working. It's not a great chance because their spellcasting ability modifier is probably pretty good. And there's going to be a decent chance they're proficient in that ability as well, and this means that they're very likely to make their save. But if a creature's casting a 9th level spell or an 8th level spell, and you have a chance as a rogue to potentially mess up that spell using your reaction, that's worth doing. Even if it's only going to work 30% of the time, that's still not terrible. And I've heard people say that it is limited to the spell levels you can cast, and that isn't true in regards to it not working against you. The second part of the ability is stealing the knowledge of the spell, which gives you the ability to cast that spell for the next 8 hours, regardless of its spell school or whether it's a wizard spell or a cleric spell, doesn't matter. And that portion of it is limited to spell levels you can cast. But the part about negating the spell is not limited. You can do that against any spell. Now, the nice thing about Spell Thief as well is it might give you access to a spell that you normally couldn't cast. But in general, I think the main advantage of Spell Thief is negating a spell effect. This is only usable once per long rest, and I totally acknowledge this isn't a great subclass ability, but I don't think it's useless. If I had Spell Thief, I'm going to use it. And it's not going to work all the time, but when it does work, it could be dramatic. Remember, even a counterspell against a 9th level spell isn't going to be guaranteed to work in most cases. Then we get to 19th and 20th level, and we are going to be able to take one spell that is limited to illusion and enchantment, and one spell that is not, and these are 4th level spells. And in both cases, there is one spell I think that is the best choice. At 19th level, I am going to take Greater Invisibility. This is far and away going to be the best choice you can make for an enchantment or illusion spell of 4th level. Greater Invisibility gives you advantage on every attack you make and disadvantage on every attack against you. And that's huge. And you can now move through combat without provoking attacks of opportunity, without having to use your cunning action. So we can be using our bonus action on other things. And of course, because we are invisible, we can also use our stealth check in order to just have it so enemies don't even know where we are. So we are able to move and suddenly the enemies don't even know where to attack us anymore. And I just think there's no other spell I'd even consider at this level. And at 20th level, when I can choose a spell from any school, I'm probably choosing Dimension Door. There are a couple other spells I would consider, but Dimension Door I think is a really strong spell for rogues, really strong spell for anybody. When we think about utility uses, Dimension Door has a ton of those, and there are a ton of in-combat uses as well. Now, I'm not going to talk about them in detail, but if I was considering something other than Dimension Door, the two spells I'd probably also think about are Watery Sphere and Banishment. These are the two spells that I think I would also consider in addition to Dimension Door, but Dimension Door is probably the spell I'd be looking at. So now that I've discussed spell selections for Arcane Trickster and Eldritch Knight, I should probably show how those work in a build. And so for the next 2 weeks, I'm going to do a build for each. Just a very basic build for Eldritch Knight, for Arcane Trickster, how I think we could just make them work very nicely using their spell selections and the class abilities available to them. So coming up in the next couple of weeks, we'll be doing a build for each of those subclasses before we move on to other topics. So until then, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks, everyone, and I will talk to you next week.